This video, we're going to take a look at transforming objects. Now, when we transform an object, we do so through move, rotate, and scale manipulators. I'm going to create a primitive object that we can play around with here. And we'll go to Sphere, and I'm just going to use a polygon object. Over to the left, we have our toolbox that contains our transformation tools. We have our Move tool that we'll begin with. And the Move tool controls our translates. So we have Translate X, Translate Y, and Translate Z. And we can see those three channels over here in the channel box. Now we can also access the Move tool by choosing W on the keyboard. If you hover over, you will get some menu help here. And when you see that letter off to the right inside the window, that is giving you the hotkey. And to access that, I'm going to hit W to grab my Move tool. And now I have that Move tool activated, and that is the same if I was going to click over here. Now, as always, we can just click an empty space to deselect that, but we can also choose Q for our Select tool, and that's going to back out of the Move tool as well. So let's hit W, go into our Move tool, and the first thing to notice here is the color coding. We have red for X, Y is green, and the selected channel is actually a yellow. But I'm going to choose my X so you can see that the Z channel is blue. Now these correspond to our world axis that you can see in the lower left corner of the viewport. This color coding is consistent throughout Maya, and it's also consistent in other programs as well. Red is X, green is Y, and blue is Z. To move my object, we can click on any one of those channels or axes. So if I want to move it along in the world X, I would click on the arrow and drag that along. Now, notice that there was a little bit of a shadow that basically stayed behind, and that just tells us where we were. It's only there for information purposes. We cannot snap back to it, but we can also just choose our undo, Control Z, and that's going to move it back into its original position. I can grab the Y and drag that up and down, and you can see that grayed shadow there that tells me where I was, or in the Z. Now, anytime you grab an arrow, you are going to be restricted to that specific axis. When the axis is actually selected, you do not have to click again on it. So for instance, we can see that the Z axis has been chosen on our transformation tool or the Move tool. If I middle mouse, I can then drag without having to actually click on that arrow again. We'll just hit undo to return it. Now I can click on the line or the arrow and then middle mouse to move my object. Now in the center of our object, you'll notice that there is a blue box. We can also select that blue box. And in doing so, it allows us to move in all three channels. Now you'll be able to see this over here in the channel box as all three values get updated. Now we also have in between our axes squares that represent two axes. So for instance, if I click on the blue square, what it will do is restrict my movement to only the Y and the X, or the green and the red. So whichever one you don't want to move, use that color coding. So for instance, if I don't want to move my sphere in the Z axis at all, I'm going to click on the blue box. So I'll click on that blue box and then just drag. Notice there in the channel box that it's only moving my object in the X and the Y. If I don't want it to move in the X, I can click on the red box and then only move it in the Y and the Z. Now, in addition to being able to interactively click on our manipulators here, we can also manipulate the object through the channel box. So if I want to move it in the X, notice how the X just got highlighted. I can click on that and then middle mouse in my viewport. And essentially all it's doing by clicking on these channels is it's selecting that axis. Same thing is that if I were to click here and then middle mouse over here. it's still just dragging the object and using the highlighted channel. Now notice, don't get confused. This is highlighted over here, but I went into the viewport and clicked on a different axis. So you do have to pay attention to the manipulator, not necessarily what you're seeing over here in the channel box. Now, of course, we can also just type in a value. So I can type in 10 there, and we'll see that it has now moved out 10 units in the translate X. And we'll just return that back to 0. And we can also affect all channels at the same time. So for instance, if I want to move this in 1 in all 3 axes there, we can just type in 1 and hit enter. And that will then move that object. So we're just going to return that back to 0, and I'll just type in 0 in the channel box. Now let's move to the rotate tool. And we can just click rotate over here in our toolbox or choose the hotkey E. I'm going to move back here and we'll just choose E. And now I'm in the rotate tool. Now the rotate tool is made up of several circles. We can click on any one of these circles and rotate our object. Notice they are color coded in the same manner that the move tool was. If I want to rotate in the Y axis, I'll click on the green circle and drag. If I want to rotate in the X, we'll highlight that X channel and middle mouse. All the same functionality that we learned with the Move tool also applies for the Rotate tool. Now to move in all 3 axes, there is a light blue ring that goes around the outside. Something we didn't get with our Move tool is that when we hover over, we get an orangish highlight there. And it also kind of shadows in different sections wherever we move our mouse, because those are actually separate manipulation areas. So let's look at the blue ring. And what this will do is rotate my object based upon my viewport or my camera angle. So it's keeping it planar to the camera itself when I rotate that blue line. That's actually really useful because we can move our camera to achieve a certain angle and then rotate the object based upon that camera angle. Now in the middle, notice how we get that gray, it's slightly more grayed out. This allows us to rotate in all 3 axes, just like with the Move tool, how it had that blue box in the middle. So if I just click, I can then rotate in all 3 axes. And let's just undo that. Now, one of the big problems I always have with the rotate tool is that sometimes it's sitting inside of my object. Now, when that object is a sphere, it can make identifying those circles a little difficult. We can use the plus or minus on the keyboard to increase the size of our manipulators. Useful when dealing with the rotate tool. We can scale that up using plus and use minus to take it back down. Let's jump over to the scale tool, which is this icon here, or the hotkey R. Scale tool is much more closely related to our Move tool in the way it functions. It has all of the same color coding. It has a blue box there in the middle that we can scale, and the same squares that we can restrict to particular axes. And notice they all highlight there with that yellowish color, signifying which axes are actually in play here. I'm going to switch back to my rotate tool. Oftentimes when we're moving an object, we want to move or change the position that the object is moving from or rotating from. We can do this by moving the object's pivot point. If I press D on the keyboard, it'll bring up a manipulator to allow me to move the object's pivot point. Now I'm actually holding D down in order to do this. And so I can just relocate that. And now I let go of D. And now my pivot point or my manipulator is in a new location. And I can rotate from that point. Another way that we can do this is by hitting Insert on the keyboard. And when we hit Insert, we only need to hit it once. And then it keeps that manipulator available to us to relocate that pivot point in any way that we need to. Now, we never need to scale a pivot point, So there's no scale tool there. We can only translate and rotate, and you can notice that plus and minus also works very well with that. To get back out of our pivot point mode, just press insert again, and that will return you back to the normal. And I can hit W. Now notice that my move tool is aligned to the exact rotation that I put in. Anytime we want to return our pivot point back to the center of the object, we can choose Modify, Center Pivot. And now that's going to center that object.